Sometimes the greatest acts of love come from seeing what others refuse to look at. In a world where we judge by appearances, one woman chose to look deeper and found something extraordinary. Brynhild lived in the village of Hestgard, where everyone knew everyone's business. When a dirty stranger appeared with no money and no family, she did something that shocked her neighbors. She married him. They called her crazy for taking in this broken man named Einar. They laughed at her kindness and whispered cruel words behind her back. But Brynhild saw something in his eyes that others missed. What she didn't know was that her homeless husband was once the most feared warrior in the northern lands. When enemies came for their village and their protectors failed, would the man everyone mocked become their hero? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a grandmother's embrace, gentle and persistent, as Brynhild stepped from her cottage into the crisp air of Hestgard. 3 months had passed since she had made the choice that set tongues wagging from the harbour to the mountain pastures, yet each dawn brought the same quiet contentment to her heart. She clutched the torn prayer cloth her mother had given her years ago, its frayed edges soft between her fingers, a reminder that broken things could still hold beauty and purpose. Hestgard was not a grand settlement by any measure. 43 souls called it home, their lives intertwined like the roots of the ancient oak that stood at the village centre. The houses, built of sturdy timber and riverstone, hugged the shoreline where fishing boats bobbed like sleeping ducks. Behind them, terraced fields climbed the gentle slopes, dotted with sheep whose bells created a constant, comforting chorus. It was a place where children learned their letters from Elder Gunnar, where Olaf the blacksmith knew every family's needs before they spoke them, and where the scent of Astrid's bread could summon neighbours from 3 houses away. This was Brynhild's world, a world that had shaped her into the woman who saw healing where others saw only hurt. She had been born to this life of service, following in the footsteps of her mother, who had followed in the steps of her grandmother before her. The women of her bloodline had always been the village healers, the ones who delivered babies in the dark, hours before dawn, and sat vigil with the dying as their final breath escaped into the winter air. Brynhild's hands knew the feel of fevered foreheads and the weight of newborn babes. Her heart had learned to carry the sorrows of others without breaking under their burden. At 26, she possessed the kind of beauty that grew more striking with each passing year, not the fleeting prettiness of youth, but the deeper radiance of a woman who had found purpose. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, often escaping from its practical braid to frame a face marked by laugh lines and the gentle creases that came from squinting into the sun while gathering herbs. Her eyes, the colour of storm-swept seas, held a wisdom that made even the eldest villagers seek her counsel. Yet for all her gifts, Brynhild had remained unwed. The young men of Hestgard respected her, certainly, but they also found her somewhat intimidating. She could set a broken bone as easily as she could birth a calf, and she possessed an unsettling ability to see through pretense to the truth beneath. Most men, she had learned, preferred wives who would not peer quite so deeply into their souls. She had made peace with solitude, or so she believed, until the morning when Einar stumbled into her life like a wounded bear seeking shelter. That day, 3 months past, remained vivid in her memory. The spring rains had turned the village paths to rivers of mud, and she had been returning from gathering willow bark when she saw him. A figure collapsed beside the stone bridge that marked Hestgard's southern entrance. At first glance, he appeared to be nothing more than a bundle of rags abandoned by some careless traveller, but as she drew closer, she detected the subtle rise and fall of breath, the faint sound of laboured breathing that spoke of a soul clinging to life. The man was enormous, even crumpled in exhaustion. His shoulders were broad enough to carry oxen, his hands large enough to span her waist. Beneath the caked mud and torn clothing, she glimpsed skin marked by scars, some old and white as bone, others newer and still tender to the touch. His hair, long and matted, showed streaks of premature silver that spoke of hardships endured. But it was his face that stopped her breath, even unconscious and filthy. There was a nobility to his features, a strength that suffering had not managed to break. Most telling of all were his eyes when they finally opened. Grey as winter seas, they held depths of sorrow that made her own heart clench with recognition. Here was a man who had lost everything, who had wandered until he could wander no more. Here was a soul as broken as her torn prayer cloth, yet somehow still holding together. The other villagers had gathered by then, drawn by curiosity and caution. Elder Gunnar stroked his white beard and muttered about strangers bringing trouble. Olaf, the blacksmith, kept his hand near his hammer, ready for violence should it be necessary. The women pulled their children closer, whispering of raiders and thieves. "He's not safe," Astrid had declared, her usually warm voice sharp with concern. "Look at the size of him. Those scars, he's a warrior, and warriors bring war." "Or perhaps," Brynhild had replied, kneeling beside the unconscious giant, "he's a man who has seen too much war and wants only peace." She had tended his wounds in her cottage, ignoring the disapproving glances and hushed conversations that followed her decision. For 3 days, he lay unconscious, his body fighting fevers that would have killed a smaller man. She fed him broth, drop by drop, changed his bandages, and watched over him as she would any patient who needed her care. When he finally awakened, his first word was an apology. "Forgive me," he had whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. "I did not mean to burden you." She had smiled then, the same gentle smile that had comforted countless villagers in their darkest hours. "Every soul deserves shelter from the storm. What is your name?" "Einar," he had said after a long pause, as if he had to remember who he was. In the weeks that followed, he had proven himself to be a man of few words but infinite gratitude. He chopped wood with an efficiency that amazed Olaf, repaired her cottage roof with hands that knew their way around timber and nails, and tended her herb garden with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his massive frame. He never spoke of his past, never explained the scars or the hollow look that sometimes crept into his eyes during the long evening silences. The villagers watched and whispered. They saw his strength and feared it. They noticed how he flinched at sudden noises, how he positioned himself always with his back to walls, how his eyes constantly scanned for threats that existed only in memory. These were not the habits of a farmer or fisherman, they muttered. These were the instincts of a warrior, and warriors meant danger. When Brynhild announced her intention to marry Einar, the village erupted in concerned protests. Elder Gunnar had taken her aside, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Child," he had said, "your heart does you credit, but this man is a mystery. We know nothing of his people, his past, his intentions. What if he brings enemies to our door? What if his silence hides darkness we cannot imagine?" "Then I will light candles until the darkness flees," she had replied, with the quiet certainty that had guided her since childhood. The wedding had been a small affair, attended more by duty than joy. Only her closest friends had offered genuine blessings. Old Magnus, who had delivered half the village's children and understood the ways of the heart. Young Henrik, the fisherman's son, who had always admired her independence. And surprisingly, Einar's rough cottage neighbour, Bjorn, who had seen the gentle way the giant tended injured animals. Now, 3 months later, Brynhild had found a happiness she had never dared to imagine. Einar proved to be a devoted husband, attentive without being possessive, protective without being controlling. He listened when she spoke of her day's healing work, offering insights that revealed a mind both sharp and compassionate. In the evenings, they sat by their fire, she with her mending and he carving small figures from driftwood animals and birds that he gave to the village children, who had overcome their initial fear to adore his gentle giant. But it was in the quiet moments that she treasured most that she caught glimpses of the man beneath the mystery. Sometimes, when he thought she was not watching, She would see him staring into the distance with such profound sadness that her heart ached in sympathy. Sometimes, in his sleep, he would murmur words in dialects she did not recognize, his hands clenching as if grasping for weapons that were no longer there. Most telling of all was what she had discovered one morning when cleaning beneath their bed. Her hand had struck something hard buried in the dirt floor, and careful excavation had revealed a sight that had stolen her breath, a war hammer of extraordinary craftsmanship, its head decorated with intricate runes, its handle worn smooth by countless battles. The weapon radiated power and history, speaking of a warrior's life that Einar had chosen to bury along with his past. She had covered it again, never speaking of her discovery, but the knowledge had changed something between them. She understood now that she had married not just a homeless stranger, but a man who had deliberately chosen homelessness over whatever life that hammer represented. The depth of his sacrifice, the weight of whatever burden had driven him to abandon everything he had been, humbled her and strengthened her love in equal measure. The villagers continued to watch and wonder, their initial fear softening into curiosity and occasionally grudging respect. Einar never raised his voice, never showed anger, never gave them reason to question his presence beyond their own suspicions. He worked harder than any man in Hestgard, asked for nothing beyond the simple life he had found with Brynhild, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to earn the trust of those willing to look past their prejudices. As the morning mist began to lift from the fjord, Brynhild made her way toward the village well, nodding to neighbors who had grown accustomed to her contentment. Behind her, she could hear the steady rhythm of Einar's axe as he split wood for their winter stores. The sound was as familiar now as her own heartbeat, a constant reminder that some of life's greatest gifts came disguised as the things others feared to touch. She tucked her mother's prayer cloth into her apron pocket and smiled, unaware that the peace she had fought to build was about to be tested in ways she could never imagine. The first sign of trouble came with the ravens. Brynhild noticed them as she returned from gathering cloudberries on the mountain slopes, her basket heavy with the tart red fruit that would help the village through the coming winter. Where normally one or two of the blackbirds might circle overhead, now dozens wheeled against the grey sky, their harsh cries creating a cacophony that sent chills down her spine. Old Magnus had always said that ravens gathered in great numbers only when death walked the land. She quickened her pace, her healer's instincts alert to signs of danger. As she crested the hill overlooking Hestgard, she saw what had drawn the scavengers, black smoke rising from the direction of the neighbouring settlement of Thornwick, 2 valleys to the east. The smoke was too thick, too persistent to be the result of cooking fires or controlled burns. This was the smoke of destruction. Einar was waiting for her at their cottage door, his massive frame tense with an alertness she had never seen before. His grey eyes swept the horizon with the calculating gaze of a man reading the landscape for threats, and his hands, those gentle hands that carved toys for children, now flexed as if seeking weapons. "The smoke," she said, setting down her basket. "Do you think—" "Raiders," he said, the single word carrying the weight of certainty. "From the sea, most likely. They've taken Thornwick." The matter-of-fact way he spoke sent ice through her veins. This was not speculation or fear, this was knowledge born of experience. Elder Gunnar's concerns about her husband's warrior past suddenly felt less like paranoia and more like prophecy. Before she could respond, the sound of running feet drew their attention to the village centre. Young Henrik came sprinting up the path, his fisher's lungs working hard, his face pale with terror. "Ships," he gasped, pointing toward the fjord. 3 longships with black sails, flying the banner of Ragnar Bloodaxe. They've sent a herald, they're demanding tribute, or they'll burn us like they burned Thornwick. Brynhild felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Ragnar Bloodaxe was a name spoken in whispers along the coast, a raider chieftain whose cruelty had become legend. Unlike the usual Vikings who raided for plunder and slaves, Bloodaxe killed for the joy of killing, leaving devastation so complete that grass would not grow on the ground where his victims fell. The village bell began to ring, not the measured tolls that marked the hours, but the frantic pealing that called for assembly in times of crisis. Einar's hand found her shoulder, steadying her as neighbors emerged from their homes with faces etched in terror. Women pulled their children close, while men reached for whatever weapons they possessed, mostly farming tools and fishing knives, woefully inadequate against trained warriors. "We have to run," Astrid cried, clutching her infant son. "Take what we can carry and flee into the mountains. It's our only chance." "And abandon everything we've built?" Elder Gunnar's voice shook with a mixture of fear and defiance. "These raiders will follow us. They always do. At least here we have walls, some protection." Brynhild looked around at the faces of her neighbors, people she had delivered as babies, whose fevers she had broken, whose sorrows she had shared. The thought of Blood Axe's warriors descending upon them, of the children being dragged away in chains, made her stomach clench with sick horror. "How many warriors do we have?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. Olaf straightened his shoulders, trying to project a confidence his eyes did not hold. "Myself, young Henrik, Bjorn, maybe 6 others if we count the older boys. Perhaps 10 men total, and most of us have never held a sword in anger." "Against how many?" Einar's voice was quiet, but it carried across the crowd with startling authority. Henrik swallowed hard. "The herald said Blood Axe commands 40 veteran raiders, each worth 3 ordinary men in battle. They've already taken 4 coastal settlements this summer. None have survived to tell what happened after the ships departed." The mathematics of despair settled over the gathered villagers like a burial shroud. 10 farmers and fishermen against 40 seasoned killers. It was not a battle, but a slaughter waiting to happen. Even if every man in Hestgard fought with the courage of berserkers, they would be overwhelmed in minutes. "Perhaps we should consider the tribute," whispered Ingrid, the weaver whose hands trembled as she spoke. "If we give them what they want." "Blood Axe doesn't honor agreements," Einar said, his words cutting through false hope like an axe through rotten wood. "He takes the tribute, then takes everything else anyway. Payment only buys time, not safety." The certainty in his voice drew stares from the assembled villagers. This was not the gentle giant who mended their tools and played with their children. This was a man who spoke of raiders and warfare with the intimate knowledge of one who had lived in that world. "How can you be so certain?" Elder Gunnar asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Einar stood silent for a long moment, his grey eyes distant as if seeing through the present to memories better left buried. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible experience. "Because I have seen what he leaves behind. I have walked through villages where the only sounds were ravens and the wind through burned timbers. I have buried children who—" The admission fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of understanding through the crowd. Here was confirmation of what they had all suspected but never dared voice. Their mild-mannered neighbor was indeed a warrior, one who had witnessed first-hand the horrors that now approached their peaceful fjord. Brynhild felt something cold settle in her chest as she watched her husband struggle with memories that clearly tortured him. The man she had married, the gentle soul who carved wooden birds and tended her herb garden, carried scars deeper than those that marked his flesh. Whatever battles he had fought, whatever scenes of destruction he had witnessed, had driven him to abandon his warrior's life in search of the very peace that Blood Axe now threatened to destroy. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her healer's instincts pushing past fear to seek solutions. "If we cannot fight and cannot flee, if tribute will not save us, what options remain?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with the prayers of desperate people. Around them, the ravens continued their death song, while the black smoke of Thornwick painted the horizon with despair. Time was running out with each breath they took, each heartbeat that brought Blood Axe's longships closer to their shore. Einar's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own. In that touch, She felt the tremor of a man wrestling with choices that would define not just their future, but his very soul. The gentle giant who had found peace in her arms now faced a choice between the life he had built and the life he had abandoned. "There may be another way," he said finally, his voice so quiet that the villagers had to strain to hear him. "But it would require me to become someone I swore I would never be again." As if summoned by his words, a horn sounded from the direction of the fjord, long, mournful notes that spoke of death sailing on black wings toward their peaceful shore. The herald had returned to his ships, and somewhere out on the dark water, Ragnar Bloodaxe was making ready for war. The inciting incident had begun, and with it, the transformation that would either save Hestgard or damn them all. The War Council, if it could be called that, convened in Elder Gunnar's home as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The largest dwelling in Hestgard, it still felt cramped, with 23 adults crowded into the main room, their faces drawn with the peculiar exhaustion that came from staring death in the face. Brynhild sat beside Einar on a rough-hewn bench, her hand resting on his forearm, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring wound too tight. Since the herald's departure, her husband had grown increasingly withdrawn, his grey eyes distant, as if he were seeing not the familiar faces of their neighbours, but ghosts from a past he had tried to bury. The centrepiece of their desperate planning lay on Gunnar's table, a crude map drawn on birch bark, showing the fjord's approach and the village's meagre defences. Olaf had sketched it with charcoal, his blacksmith's steady hand creating lines that somehow made their situation look even more hopeless than it felt. "The ships will anchor here." Henrik pointed to a spot where the fjord widened near the village, close enough to prevent escape by water, far enough to avoid our fishing spears. They'll send landing parties in small boats, probably 3 groups, to surround the village. "How long do we have?" asked Astrid, bouncing her fussy infant against her shoulder. "The herald said dawn." Gunnar replied, his weathered fingers tracing the prayer beads his grandmother had carved. "Bloodaxe likes to attack with the rising sun, claims it makes the blood show prettier on his axe." A shudder ran through the gathered villagers at the mental image those words conjured. Brynhild felt Einar's arm tense beneath her touch, and she glanced at his profile, noting how his jaw had set like granite. The gentle man who sang lullabies to the village children was transforming before her eyes into something harder, more dangerous. "We could try to hold them at the pier," suggested Bjorn, though his voice lacked conviction. "Force them to come at us from one direction." "With what?" Olaf's question carried the bitter edge of reality. "We have fishing nets, farm tools, maybe 3 real spears between us. They have war axes, swords, shields, and the skill to use them." "Then we evacuate," declared Magnus, the old midwife's voice sharp with protective instinct. "Take the children into the high caves, wait for them to leave." "They won't leave," Einar spoke. For the first time since entering Gunnar's home, his voice carrying a finality that silenced the room. "Bloodaxe doesn't raid for treasure alone. He raids for the joy of destruction. If he finds an empty village, he'll burn it and wait. When winter drives us down from the mountains, we'll die of cold instead of steel. The result is the same." The brutal honesty of his assessment settled over them like a burial shroud. These were not the words of a man guessing at possibilities, but of one who had witnessed the aftermath of such raids firsthand. "You speak as one who knows him," Gunnar observed, his pale eyes studying Einar with new intensity. "Have you encountered this Bloodaxe before?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, carrying implications that made several villagers shift uncomfortably on their seats. Brynhild felt her husband's breathing change, becoming shallow and controlled, as if he were fighting some internal battle. "I know his reputation," Einar said finally, the words carefully chosen. "I know the stories of what he leaves behind." It was not quite a lie, but neither was it the full truth, and everyone in the room sensed the careful parsing of his words. The gentle giant who had appeared at their gates 3 months ago carried knowledge of raiders and warfare that ran deeper than mere reputation. "Stories won't save us," Henrik said, his youthful voice cracking with strain. "We need a miracle, or we need a warrior who can match their skill." All eyes turned toward Einar, the unspoken question written clearly on their faces. Here sat a man whose scars spoke of battles, whose knowledge of raiders seemed intimate, whose very presence suggested a violent past. Yet the same man had spent 3 months proving his gentleness, his commitment to peace, his desire to build rather than destroy. Brynhild watched her husband struggle with the weight of their expectations and fears. She could see the war being fought behind his grey eyes, the man he had been warring with, the man he had chosen to become. The hidden warhammer beneath their cottage floor suddenly felt like a living thing, calling to its master from the earth that held it. "I am not the man I once was," Einar said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "That person did things, saw things, that drove him to seek redemption in silence and service. I came here to escape that life, not to reclaim it. But could you?" The question came from an unexpected source, Ingrid the Weaver, whose gentle nature rivaled Brynhild's own. "Could you become that man again, if our children's lives depended on it?" The moral weight of the question seemed to bow Einar's massive shoulders. Brynhild felt his internal struggle as if it were her own, understanding for the first time the true depth of sacrifice he had made in choosing their peaceful life. Whatever he had been before, whatever skills he possessed, they came with a cost that had driven him to abandon everything familiar. "The man I was before would save you," Einar admitted, each word seeming to cause him physical pain, "but he would also damn me. There are prices for such salvation that extend far beyond the battlefield." "What prices?" Gunnar asked gently, his elder's wisdom sensing the deeper currents beneath Einar's words. Einar's hand found Brynhild's, gripping it like a lifeline, as he struggled with memories that clearly tortured him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of profound regret. The man who could defeat Blood Axe stopped believing in mercy long before he earned his name. He became something that children feared in stories, something that mothers used to frighten their young into obedience. "If I become him again, even to save you, I'm not certain I could find my way back to the man who loves Brynhild, who carves toys for your children, who has found peace in this gentle place." The admission fell into silence, broken only by the crackling of Gunnar's fire and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Here was the heart of their dilemma laid bare. Salvation might be possible, but only at the cost of the very soul they sought to protect. Brynhild squeezed her husband's hand, feeling the calluses earned through months of honest labor, the gentle strength that had held her through difficult nights. The choice before them was impossible: preserve the man she loved and watch their world burn, or ask him to sacrifice his hard-won peace to become the very thing he had fled. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, indifferent witnesses to the struggle playing out in the crowded cottage. Soon, very soon, dawn would come, and with it the ships of Ragnar Blood Axe. The night that followed brought no sleep to Hestgard. Brynhild sat by her cottage window, watching the distant flicker of torches on the black water where Blood Axe's longships waited like hungry wolves. Beside her, Einar remained motionless as carved stone, his eyes fixed on some invisible horizon that existed only in his memories. The space between them felt charged with unspoken words and the weight of choices that would reshape their world. Throughout the village, families huddled together in their homes, speaking in whispers as if loud voices might summon the raiders from the darkness. Some prayed to the old gods, others to the new Christ, and a few to whatever powers might listen to the desperate pleas of simple folk facing annihilation. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for dawn to break the terrible tension. "Tell me about him," Brynhild said finally, her voice soft as silk but steady as bedrock. "The man you were before." Einar's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, the only outward sign of the storm raging within him. For a long moment she thought he might not answer, might retreat further into the silence that had become his refuge from painful truths. His name was Einar the Shield-breaker, he said at last, the words emerging like blood from a wound. Champion of Jarnvik, scourge of the eastern seas. Men spoke his name in the same breath as the gods of war, and mothers frightened their children with tales of his coming. She had expected something like this, had prepared herself for the revelation that her gentle husband had once been a warrior of renown. But the pain in his voice spoke of something deeper than mere violence. It spoke of a soul torn apart by the very actions that had made him legendary. "What changed you?" she asked, her healer's instincts probing gently toward the source of his anguish. "A village called Hestgard." Einar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We had cornered a rival jarl there, him and his household warriors. The battle was won, the enemy defeated. Custom demanded that we burn the village as a warning to others who might oppose our lord." He paused, his breath coming in short, controlled gasps, as if the memory itself were choking him. Brynhild waited, knowing that some wounds could only be healed by letting the poison flow out completely. "There were children," he continued, each word scraped raw from his throat, "hidden in the root cellar of the largest house. The other warriors would have found them eventually, would have done what warriors do to the weak and helpless. I could have walked away, could have let someone else carry that burden. Instead, I stood guard over that cellar door and refused to let them pass." The image formed in Brynhild's mind, her massive husband standing alone against his own warband, choosing mercy over the brutal customs of his world. She could picture the scene, the shield-breaker, legend of the northern seas, defying everything he had been raised to believe for the sake of innocent lives. "Your own men turned against you. Some did, others understood, even if they couldn't support me openly. The Jarl gave me a choice: burn the village myself to prove my loyalty, or be cast out as an oath-breaker and coward. I chose exile." Brynhild felt tears sting her eyes as understanding bloomed like sunrise in her chest. The gentle giant who had appeared at their gates, broken and seeking redemption, was not running from his failures, but from his greatest triumph, the moment when he had chosen conscience over glory, mercy over might. "You saved those children," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I saved 5 children and damned my own soul in the eyes of every warrior I had ever known. They called me oath-breaker, coward, woman-hearted. My own brother spat in the dust at my feet and swore never to speak my name again. I became a ghost, wandering the edges of the world, seeking something, anything, that might wash the blood from my hands." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning the chasm of his past and present. Brynhild understood now why he had buried his warhammer beneath their cottage floor, why he flinched at sudden sounds, why his eyes sometimes held depths of sadness that made her heart ache. The man she had married was not just a former warrior, he was a warrior reborn, transformed by one moment of moral courage into something entirely new. "And now?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Now that choice comes again," Einar said, his grey eyes reflecting the distant torches like cold stars. "I can remain the man who chose mercy, who found peace in your arms and purpose in your healing work. Or I can become the shield-breaker one last time, summon the fury that once made strong men weep, and save a village by becoming the very thing I swore never to be again." A soft knock at their door interrupted the moment, and Brynhild rose to find young Henrik standing in the threshold, his face pale in the moonlight. Behind him she could see other figures moving through the darkness, parents clutching, sleeping children, elders carrying precious belongings, the quiet procession of a people preparing for the end of their world. "Brynhild," Henrik whispered urgently, "Elder Gunnar wants to speak with you both. The children are being taken to the caves as we discussed. But there's been a development. One of the fishermen, old Knut, he says, He's seen Blood Axe before, years ago when he was young. He has information that might change our options. Einar rose slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. In the moonlight, Brynhild could see the transformation beginning, subtle changes in the way he held himself, the way his eyes scanned the darkness for threats, the way his hands fell naturally to positions where weapons should hang. The shield breaker was stirring, called forth by necessity and the desperate need of innocent people. "What manner of information?" Einar asked, and Brynhild noted that his voice had changed too harder, more focused, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "He knows where Blood Axe keeps his personal treasure," Henrik said, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. "A hidden hoard on Raven Island, 3 leagues north of here. If we could threaten it somehow—" "No," Einar cut him off with quiet finality. Blood Axe would let his treasure burn before he'd show mercy to a village that defied him. Old Knut's information is valuable, but not for the reasons you think. The authority in his voice, the instant dismissal of a strategy that desperate people wanted to believe might work, told Brynhild more clearly than any confession that her husband's transformation had truly begun. The gentle man who carved toys was stepping aside, making room for the warrior who might save them all. Old Knut's weathered hands shook as he held the drinking horn, the amber liquid within trembling like his voice. At 73 winters, he had seen more of the world than most in Hestgard, his fishing expeditions having taken him far along the treacherous northern coasts. Now, in Gunnar's crowded cottage, his rheumy eyes held the weight of terrible knowledge. "I was but 16 when I first saw Ragnar Blood Axe," the old fisherman began, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "My father had taken me north to the Whale Islands for the summer fishing. That's where Blood Axe's fleet was anchored, preparing for raids against the southern kingdoms." Einar leaned forward, his transformation from peaceful giant to attentive warrior becoming more pronounced with each passing moment. The others, Gunnar, Olaf, Henrik, and a handful of the village's bravest men, watched him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They needed a savior, but increasingly understood that salvation might come at the cost of the gentle soul they had grown to respect. "Tell me about his ships," Einar said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a military commander. "How many? What condition? How were they provisioned?" 3 longships, then. "Same as now," Knut replied, his memory sharpening as he fell into the rhythm of his tale. The Sea Serpent, the Bone Crusher, and his flagship, the Blood Eagle. 40 oars each, built for speed and terror. But here's what made him different from other raiders: he never stayed at sea long, always returned to the same base. "Raven Island," Henrik interjected eagerly. "The hidden hoard you mentioned." "Not just a hoard," Knut corrected, his ancient eyes growing distant with memory. "A fortress, carved into the living rock of the island's heart, protected by channels that only Blood Axe's pilots know how to navigate. He's been building it for 20 years, turning it into something that could withstand a siege by the gods themselves." Brynhild watched her husband process this information, noting how his mind seemed to shift into patterns she had never seen before. This was not the contemplative man who pondered herb gardens and wood carvings, but a tactical genius calculating angles of attack and defensive vulnerabilities. The shield breaker was indeed awakening, called forth by the desperate need of the village he had grown to love. "The channels," Einar mused, his fingers drumming against the wooden table in unconscious rhythm. "You said only his pilots know them. But you were there, did you see how the approaches were navigated?" Knut's face brightened with sudden hope. I did. My father was curious about such things, taught me to read water-like script on parchment. The channels follow a pattern, ancient runestones placed by the first settlers, navigate by the old marks, and the deep water reveals itself. Could you guide a small boat through those channels? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that made the gathered men exchange uncertain glances. Here was the beginning of a plan, though none could yet see its full shape. Brynhild felt her heart clench with foreboding. Whatever strategy was forming in her husband's mind, it would require him to fully embrace the violent skills he had fought so hard to leave behind. "I could try," Knut said slowly, "but what good would that do? Men who've sworn blood oaths to die before allowing strangers near his treasure. The treasure isn't the target," Einar said, his voice carrying a certainty that both thrilled and terrified his listeners. "It's the symbol. Blood Axe has built his reputation on being untouchable, unreachable. His strength comes not just from his warriors, but from the fear that his name inspires. Strike at his stronghold, really strike at it, not just threaten, and you wound something more precious than gold." Olaf leaned forward, his blacksmith's mind grappling with the tactical implications. "You're talking about damaging his reputation, making him seem vulnerable. But how does that help us here? He'll still have 40 warriors at dawn, and we'll still have 10 farmers with fish spears." Gunnar finished grimly. "I see the logic in your thinking, Einar, but the mathematics remain unchanged. Even if we could somehow reach his island, even if we could strike this symbolic blow, his fleet would still be here to destroy us." Einar stood slowly, his massive frame dominating the small cottage as he moved to the window. Outside, the enemy torches flickered like evil stars on the dark water, a constant reminder of the doom sailing toward their peaceful shore. When he turned back to face the assembled men, something fundamental had changed in his bearing. The last vestiges of the gentle exile were falling away, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "You're thinking like farmers and fishermen," he said, his words carrying no insult, only the patient explanation of a master teaching students. "I'm thinking like a warrior who once commanded fleets twice the size of blood axes. The mathematics are not as simple as you believe." He moved to Gunnar's crude map, his finger tracing the coastline with the sure knowledge of one who had studied such terrain for strategic advantage. "Blood Axe anchors his ships here, in the deep water beyond the shallows. Standard raider tactics, close enough to prevent escape, far enough to avoid being trapped if the tide turns against them. But that positioning also creates vulnerabilities that desperate men might exploit." "What kind of vulnerabilities?" Henrik asked, his young voice tight with hope and fear in equal measure. "Fire ships," Einar said simply. "Fill a fishing boat with pitch and kindling, set it ablaze, and let the current carry it into their fleet. In the confusion that follows warriors trying to save their precious longships, a small force might have opportunities that would otherwise be impossible." The plan took shape as he spoke, each element building upon the last with the inexorable logic of a master strategist. But Brynhild could see the cost written in the lines of strain around her husband's eyes, in the way his hands unconsciously flexed as if gripping weapons, in the hard authority that was replacing his gentle wisdom. The shield breaker was indeed returning, but each step toward their salvation carried Einar further from the man she had fallen in love with. "You're talking about a two-pronged assault," Gunnar said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his weathered features. "Strike the island to damage his reputation while simultaneously attacking his fleet. Force him to fight on two fronts with divided attention." "I'm talking about war," Einar corrected, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Real war, fought by someone willing to do whatever victory requires. The question is whether Hestgard is prepared for the cost such salvation demands." The preparations began before moonset, carried out in whispered urgency as the village transformed itself from a peaceful fishing settlement into something resembling a military camp. Brynhild found herself caught between admiration and heartbreak as she watched her husband orchestrate the defense of Hestgard with the cold efficiency of a born commander. Every decision Einar made carried the weight of hard experience, which men would sail with Knut to Raven Island, which would remain to defend the village, how the precious fishing boats should be modified for war. He moved through the darkness like a shadow made flesh, checking preparations, adjusting plans, speaking in low, urgent tones with men who had begun to look at him with the desperate hope reserved for saviors. In Olaf's smithy, the blacksmith worked by the light of banked coals, muffling the ring of his hammer with thick leather as he shaped fishing hooks into war arrows and reinforced the hafts of woodsmen's axes. The transformation of peaceful tools into weapons of war seemed to symbolize everything that was happening to their world, beauty and gentleness being sacrificed on the altar of necessity. "The boats are ready," Henrik reported as he slipped into the smithy, where Einar was examining the modified weapons. The young fisherman's face was streaked with pitch and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determined fire. "We've packed the seal hunter with everything that will burn, old nets soaked in fish oil, dried driftwood, even some of Astrid's tallow candles." Einar nodded, testing the balance of a spear that Olaf had fitted with a proper iron head. The weapon moved in his massive hands like a living thing, responding to muscle memory that 3 months of peace had not entirely erased. "And the men who will sail her?" "Bjorn volunteered to guide her in," Henrik replied. "Says he'd rather burn with his boat than watch Blood-Axe's warriors drag his grandchildren away in chains. Bjorn is brave, but this requires more than courage," Einar said, his tactical mind already working through the complexities of the night attack. "The fireship must reach their fleet at precisely the right moment too early, and they'll have time to recover. Too late, and the distraction will be useless. The timing depends on factors that only an experienced warrior can judge." The implication hung heavy in the smoky air of the smithy. Brynhild felt her heart clench as understanding bloomed like a poisonous flower in her chest. Not only was Einar planning to resume his role as a warrior, but he intended to place himself at the very center of the most dangerous part of their desperate gambit. "You mean to guide the fire ship yourself," she said, her healer's intuition cutting through military necessity to the personal cost beneath. Einar's grey eyes met hers across the crowded smithy, and in them she saw both the man she had married and the legendary warrior he was becoming once again. The two identities seemed to war within those depths, gentle Einar fighting a losing battle against the tactical genius of the shield breaker. "The attack on Raven Island is a distraction," he explained, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher, though she could hear the strain beneath it. "Important for damaging Blood-Axe's reputation, but not decisive. The real battle will be fought here, when his warriors come ashore, expecting easy conquest, and find something else waiting for them." "And you believe one fire ship will be enough to create that opportunity?" Olaf asked, pausing in his work to study the man who had begun to reshape their understanding of what might be possible. "One fire ship guided by someone who knows how warriors think, how they react to unexpected threats, how their training can be turned against them." Einar moved to the smithy's single window, gazing out at the enemy torches that marked their deadline. Blood-Axe's men are veterans, but they're also predictable. They've spent years fighting farmers and fishermen who break and run at the first sight of Viking steel. They won't be prepared for organized resistance. Brynhild watched her husband speak of violence and tactical advantage with the casual expertise of a craftsman discussing his trade, and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not the gentle giant who had carved wooden birds for the village children, who had sung lullabies to calm her nightmares, who had found redemption in the simple act of healing rather than harming. This was the shield breaker, and with each word he spoke, her Einar seemed to recede further into memory. "What of the men who sailed to Raven Island?" she asked, desperate to understand the full scope of what he was planning. "If you're here with the fire ship, who leads them against Blood-Axe's stronghold?" "Henrik," Einar replied without hesitation, and the young fisherman's eyes widened with shock. "He knows boats, he understands water, and he's brave enough to do what needs to be done. Knut will guide them through the channels, but Henrik will lead them once they reach the island." "I don't know anything about fighting warriors," Henrik protested, his voice cracking with the strain of sudden responsibility. "I'm a fisherman, not a war leader." You don't need to fight them, Einar explained, his tactical mind already 10 moves ahead of their desperate present. Your job is to create noise, to make Bloodaxe believe his precious stronghold is under serious assault. Burn what you can, break what you can't burn, and make sure the smoke is visible from the fjord. The actual damage matters less than the appearance of vulnerability. As he spoke, Einar moved with unconscious authority to Olaf's map, his finger tracing routes and possibilities, with the sure knowledge of a commander who had planned similar operations countless times before. The gentle exile who had appeared at their gates was gone, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous and far less recognizable. "There's something else," Brynhild said quietly, her healer's instincts recognizing symptoms that others might miss. "You're not just planning to fight Bloodaxe's warriors. You're planning to become someone who can kill them without hesitation, without mercy, without the compassion that brought you to our village. Once you cross that line again, how do we know you'll be able to find your way back?" The question stopped Einar mid-gesture, his hand frozen above the crude map as the full weight of her concern settled upon him. For a moment, the mask of military efficiency slipped, and she caught a glimpse of the man she had married, the one who had chosen exile over violence, who had buried his warhammer in the dirt rather than use it for its intended purpose. "We don't," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the smithy's walls. "That's the price Hestgard will pay for salvation. The man who saves them may not be the one who returns to them afterward. The betrayal came with the first grey fingers of dawn, delivered by the last person anyone would have suspected." Brynhild was making final preparations in their cottage, gathering herbs that might be needed to treat wounds, when she heard the commotion from the village centre. Voices raised in anger and confusion, the sound of running feet, and beneath it all, the unmistakable ring of steel being drawn from sheaths. She grabbed her leather satchel of medicines and hurried toward the disturbance, her heart hammering with dread. What she found defied comprehension. Elder Gunnar stood in the pale morning light, with his hands bound behind his back, flanked by 2 warriors in the distinctive horned helmets of Bloodaxe's personal guard. But it was the third figure that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Astrid, the baker whose bread had fed the village for 20 years, whose infant son she had delivered barely 6 months ago, stood beside the enemy warriors with a satisfied smile playing across her lips. "You look surprised, my dear Brynhild," Astrid said, her voice carrying a mocking tone that bore no resemblance to the warm woman who had offered comfort during the dark hours of planning. "Did you really think your precious husband's reputation was such a secret, that the shield breaker could simply disappear into our little village without anyone noticing?" Einar emerged from Olaf's smithy at the sound of voices, the war hammer he had retrieved from beneath their cottage floor gleaming dully in his massive hands. The sight of the legendary weapon runes carved deep into its iron head, leather wrapping worn smooth by countless battles, sent murmurs of recognition through the gathered villagers. Here was proof that their gentle neighbour had indeed been one of the most feared warriors in the northern lands. But it was the look in his grey eyes as they fixed upon Astrid that truly revealed the return of the shield breaker. Gone entirely was the gentle giant who had carved toys for children. In his place stood something primal and terrible, a force of nature barely contained within human form. "How long?" he asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant lips. "Since the day you arrived," Astrid replied, her smugness undimmed by the deadly focus of his attention. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize the scars, the way you moved, the manner in which your eyes constantly scanned for threats? I've seen enough warriors to know one when he's standing in my kitchen begging for bread." The revelation hit the assembled villagers like a physical blow. Their trusted neighbour, the woman who had baked their wedding cakes and sung lullabies to their children, had been watching and reporting for 3 months. Every plan they had made, every desperate preparation, had been known to their enemies before the ink was dry on Gunnar's crude maps. "The attack on Raven Island," Henrik said, his voice hollow with understanding. "They'll be waiting." "Oh, yes," Astrid laughed, the sound harsh as breaking glass. "Ragnar knows all about your clever plan. The channels you thought to navigate, the reputation you hoped to damage. He's been preparing surprises of his own. Young Henrik and brave Knut will sail straight into a trap that will make their deaths last for days." Brynhild felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Not only had their plans been compromised, but the men they had sent to create a distraction were sailing towards certain death. The carefully orchestrated assault that represented their only hope had become a complex execution designed to break their spirits before the real slaughter began. Why? The question came from Olaf, his blacksmith's honest nature struggling to comprehend such treachery. Why betray your own people? These are your neighbors, your friends. You delivered half our children yourself. Because survival requires choices that gentle souls like you cannot understand, Astrid replied, her false mask of neighborly warmth finally falling away entirely. Blood Axe approached me months ago, during my trading trip to the southern markets. He knew the shield breaker had been seen in this region, knew that eventually the great warrior would seek a place to rest his weary head. He offered gold beyond counting for information, protection for myself and my son when the slaughter came, and passage to new lands where no one would know what I had done. The warrior standing to her right, a scarred veteran with cold eyes and an axe that had clearly tasted much blood, stepped forward and spoke in the harsh dialect of the Eastern Raiders. "Ragnar Bloodaxe sends his greetings to the legendary shield breaker," the man said, his words carefully pronounced as if learned by rote. "He says that your reputation has grown stale in your absence, that men have begun to whisper that the great warrior has grown soft in his exile. He offers you a chance to prove them wrong." "What chance?" Einar asked, though Brynhild could see in his stance that he already suspected the answer. "Single combat," the warrior continued, "aboard his flagship, with the entire village watching from the shore. Win, and your people go free, their homes unburned, their children unharmed. Lose, and they suffer fates that will be remembered in stories for generations to come. You have until the sun reaches its peak to decide." The offer fell into silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves against stone and the harsh cries of circling ravens. Here was the true trap, not the tactical deception that had compromised their military plans, but a personal challenge that struck at the very heart of Einar's moral transformation. Bloodaxe had studied his enemy well, understanding that the man who had chosen exile over burning a village full of children could never refuse a chance to spare innocent lives, no matter the cost to himself. Brynhild watched her husband's face as he processed the implications. The Shieldbreaker could defeat almost any warrior in single combat. His reputation had been built on precisely such victories. But the man who would need to emerge for such a battle was the very one he had fought so hard to bury. The gentle soul who had found redemption in their peaceful village would have to die completely for the warrior to live again. "And if I refuse?" Einar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew this answer as well. "Then the burning begins immediately," Astrid said with cheerful malice. "Every cottage, every boat, every scrap of wood that might provide shelter. The children will be sold in the slave markets of the eastern kingdoms, the women given to Bloodaxe's warriors as playthings, the men hung from the masts of his longships as decorations. Your refusal to fight will be the last mercy any of them ever experience." The moral mathematics were as clear as they were brutal. Einar could sacrifice himself in combat, trusting that his legendary skills would be sufficient to defeat Bloodaxe, or he could watch everything he had grown to love burn in the flames of his enemy's cruelty. The choice between personal damnation and collective destruction, the same terrible decision that had driven him into exile, now returned in its final, most devastating form. Around them, the villagers began to understand the true dimensions of their trap. Their careful plans had been worse than useless. They had been turned into instruments of their own destruction. The men sailing toward Raven Island were already dead, their sacrifice meaningless except as entertainment for Blood Axe's warriors. The weapons they had prepared, the courage they had summoned, the hope they had nurtured, all of it had been reduced to the outcome of a single fight between two legendary warriors. Brynhild felt something break inside her chest as she watched her husband's shoulders settle into the familiar lines of the shield breaker's terrible purpose. The man she had married, the gentle soul who had found redemption in healing rather than harming, was about to die as surely as if he had fallen on his own sword. In his place would stand only the warrior victorious or defeated, but either way, lost to her forever. The greatest betrayal was not Astrid's treachery, but the realization that Blood Axe had never intended to fight a village at all. He had come to reclaim the shield breaker, to force the legendary warrior out of his self-imposed exile for one final, devastating confrontation. Everything else, the threats, the military preparations, the desperate plans had been merely the bait in a trap designed to catch the most dangerous prey in the northern seas. As the morning sun climbed toward its peak, marking the inexorable countdown to single combat, Brynhild understood that, regardless of who won the coming battle, she had already lost the only thing that truly mattered to her. The hours that followed Astrid's betrayal moved with the inexorable weight of fate itself, each moment carrying the village closer to a confrontation that would reshape the destiny of everyone who drew breath in Hestgard. Brynhild found herself caught in the strange calm that often preceded great storms, watching her husband prepare for battle with the methodical precision of a master craftsman approaching his finest work. The enemy warriors had departed with their treacherous ally, returning to Blood Axe's flagship to report the success of their mission. But they had left behind a promise that hung over the village like smoke from a funeral pyre. The challenge would be honored at midday, when the sun reached its peak and cast the shortest shadows. Until then, the people of Hestgard were free to contemplate the magnitude of what was about to unfold on their quiet shore. Einar sat on the stone wall that bordered their cottage garden, the war hammer resting across his knees like a sleeping serpent. The weapon seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, its ancient runes catching the morning light in ways that made them appear to writhe and shift. This was not merely a tool of war, but an artifact of legend, the very hammer that had shattered the shields of 100 champions, that had carved the shield breaker's reputation from the bones of his enemies. "Do you remember the first time you held it?" Brynhild asked, settling beside him on the sun-warmed stone. She needed to understand the full measure of what he was about to reclaim, to comprehend the weight of the identity he had buried beneath their cottage floor. "My 16th summer," he replied, his grey eyes distant with memory. "My father placed it in my hands the day I earned my warrior's braids. It was forged by the dwarf smiths of the eastern mountains, blessed by the blood of 7 kings, tempered in water, blessed by the gods themselves. The runes were carved by a seer who prophesied that it would never know defeat, while wielded by one with the courage to pay its price." "What price?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "The hammer feeds on the warrior's humanity," Einar said, his voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. "Each battle fought, each victory won, each enemy slain, all of it burns away another piece of the man who holds it. The weapon grants unmatched skill and terrible strength, but it demands the soul of its wielder in return. By the time I earned the name Shield Breaker, I had given so much of myself to this hammer that I barely remembered what it felt like to be human." The confession fell between them like a stone cast into still water, sending ripples of understanding through Brynhild's consciousness. Now she comprehended why he had buried the weapon, why he had chosen exile over glory, why the simple act of carving wooden toys for children had brought tears to his eyes. He had not merely been fleeing his reputation, he had been trying to reclaim his own soul from the weapon that had devoured it piece by piece. Around them, the village continued its grim preparations with the quiet dignity of people who understood they might be witnessing their final hours. Olaf had abandoned his forge to spend time with his grandchildren, teaching them songs his own grandfather had sung. Magnus, the midwife, moved from house to house, offering what comfort she could to families facing an uncertain future. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, playing their games with unusual solemnity, as if they understood that childhood itself might be ending with the rising sun. The absence of Henrik Knut and the other men who had sailed toward Raven Island created holes in the fabric of the community that everyone felt but no one spoke about directly. Their families maintained brave faces, but Brynhild could see the knowledge in their eyes. Their loved ones were sailing toward death, their sacrifice transformed from heroic distraction into meaningless slaughter by Astrid's treachery. "There might be another way," she said suddenly, the healer in her refusing to accept that all paths led to the same dark destination. "What if we simply refuse Bloodaxe's challenge? What if we evacuate the village, disappear into the mountains before midday arrives?" Einar's smile held no humor, only the sad wisdom of a man who had spent years learning the brutal mathematics of power. "Bloodaxe would hunt us through every valley and cave in the northern lands. He hasn't come all this way just to raid another village, Brynhild. He's come to reclaim something he believes belongs to him, the reputation that my exile has begun to tarnish. In his mind, the shield breaker's withdrawal from the world of warriors makes him look weak by association. My peaceful life here is an insult to everything he represents." "So this has nothing to do with Hestgard at all," she said, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "We're simply the bait in a trap designed to force you back into the life you abandoned." "The village matters," he assured her, his massive hand covering hers with surprising gentleness. "These people have become my family. This place has become my home. But you're right that Bloodaxe's true goal is forcing the Shieldbreaker to emerge from hiding. He needs to prove that his way, the path of endless violence and conquest, is the only one that matters. My existence as a peaceful man threatens the very foundation of what he believes." As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the fjord, other preparations began in earnest. The enemy longships had moved closer to shore, their black hulls gleaming like the carapaces of massive insects. Warriors could be seen moving about the decks, their weapons and armor catching the light in threatening flashes. The largest ship, the Blood Eagle, dominated the center of the formation, its dragon-head prow seeming to sneer at the peaceful village that dared to shelter a fallen champion. Brynhild helped her husband don the armor that had been hidden alongside his hammer mail, forged from rings of iron and steel, a helmet decorated with wings that had once struck terror into the hearts of enemies, bracers and greaves that bore the scars of countless battles. Each piece seemed to transform him further, the gentle giant disappearing beneath layers of war gear, like a man putting on the skin of a different creature entirely. But it was when he lifted the warhammer for the first time in 3 months that the transformation became complete. The weapon rose to his grip as if it had been waiting for this reunion, and suddenly the man standing before her bore no resemblance to the broken exile who had collapsed beside their village bridge. This was the shield breaker in all his terrible glory, a force of nature barely contained within human form, a storm given flesh and purpose. "Promise me something," she said as he tested the hammer's balance with movements that spoke of muscle memory ingrained over decades of warfare. "Promise me that no matter what happens out there, no matter what you have to become to win, you'll try to find your way back to the man I married." He paused in his preparations, the hammer falling still in his hands as he met her eyes. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of her Einar beneath the warrior's mask, the gentle soul who had found redemption in healing rather than harming, who had chosen love over legend. "I will try," he said. Though his voice carried the weight of a man making a promise he was not certain he could keep. But the hammer feeds on humanity, and Bloodaxe is no ordinary enemy. To defeat him, I may have to become something that no longer remembers how to love. The admission hung between them, as the sun continued its relentless climb toward midday. Around them, the villagers began to gather along the shoreline, drawn by the approaching spectacle despite the danger it represented. They came as witnesses to something that would be spoken of in stories for generations: the return of the legendary shield breaker, the confrontation between two of the most feared warriors in the northern lands. A horn sounded from the direction of the Blood Eagle, its mournful note echoing across the water like the voice of fate itself. The challenge had been issued, the terms accepted, the stage set for a battle that would determine the destiny of everyone who called Hestgard home. Einar rose from the stone wall, the war hammer gleaming in his grasp like captured lightning. The gentle giant who had carved toys for children was gone, perhaps forever. In his place stood the shield breaker, and as he began his walk toward the water's edge, Brynhild felt her heart break with the knowledge that regardless of who emerged victorious from the coming combat, she had already lost the only thing that truly mattered to her. The man she loved was about to die, sacrificed on the altar of necessity and legend, and there was nothing her healer's hands could do to prevent it. The Blood Eagle cut through the dark waters like a predator, returning to familiar hunting grounds, her dragon-head prow carved with such malevolent artistry that it seemed to breathe fire with each surge of the waves. As the massive longship approached the shallow waters near Hestgard's shore, the assembled villagers could make out the figure standing at her bow, Ragnar Bloodaxe himself, a man whose reputation had grown so dark that mothers used his name to frighten disobedient children across half the known world. He was smaller than the legend suggested, though no less terrifying for it. Where Einar's strength came from his massive frame and natural power, Bloodaxe radiated a different kind of menace, the concentrated violence of a man who had refined killing into an art form. His armor was black as a moonless night, decorated with bones that had once belonged to defeated champions. The axe that hung at his side gleamed with the peculiar sheen of a blade that had tasted so much blood it could never be completely clean. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as something beyond ordinary evil. They held the flat, reptilian indifference of a creature that had long ago stopped seeing other humans as anything more than obstacles to be removed or toys to be broken. When he smiled as he did now, gazing upon the peaceful village that had dared to shelter his greatest rival, it was the expression of a predator, anticipating a particularly satisfying meal. Einar stood knee-deep in the fjord's cold water, the war hammer balanced in his hands with the casual grace of a man born to violence. The transformation was complete now. Every trace of the gentle giant had been burned away in the forge of necessity, leaving only the shield breaker in all his terrible glory. The ancient runes carved into his armor seemed to pulse with their own inner light, responding to the proximity of worthy combat. So, Bloodaxe called across the narrowing distance, his voice carrying the harsh accent of the Eastern Kingdoms. The great shield breaker emerges from his hole at last. Tell me, legend, how does it feel to abandon the weak and defenseless you've been playing house with? Does their terror make you remember what you truly are? The insult was calculated with surgical precision, designed to provoke the kind of rage that might cloud judgment and create openings in an otherwise perfect defense. But Einar had faced such psychological warfare countless times before, and his response carried the cold certainty of a man who had long ago made peace with his own darkness. "I remember everything, Bloodaxe," he replied, his voice carrying across the water with authority that made the very air seem to tremble. "I remember the weight of every life I've taken, the sound of every widow's weeping, the smell of every village I've burned in service to lords who valued glory over mercy. I remember what I was and what I chose to become. The question is whether you remember why they call me the Shield Breaker." Bloodaxe's laughter rang across the water like the breaking of glass, harsh and sharp enough to cut. "I remember stories told by old men to impress children. I remember a warrior who grew soft in his dotage, who chose exile over the honest work of killing. You've been playing farmer for 3 months, Shield Breaker. I've been perfecting my craft." The longship ground against the sandy bottom with a sound like grinding teeth, and Bloodaxe leaped down into the shallow water with the fluid grace of a man half his apparent age. His black armor seemed to drink the sunlight, creating an aura of shadow around him that made the very air appear darker. The bone decorations on his war gear rattled with each movement, creating a rhythm like the chattering of skeleton teeth. The two warriors approached each other through the knee-deep water, with the measured pace of masters acknowledging each other's skill. This was not the wild charge of berserkers or the desperate flailing of untrained fighters. This was the careful dance of legends, each step calculated to reveal nothing while gathering intelligence about the opponent's capabilities and intentions. Around the edges of the fjord, the people of Hestgard watched in silence, broken only by the soft sobbing of children too young to understand why the air itself seemed charged with menace. Brynhild stood among them, her healer's hands clenched into fists, watching the man she loved prepare to either save them all or damn himself in the attempt. "The terms," Bloodaxe said as the distance between them closed to perhaps 20 paces, "are simple enough. Single combat, no quarter asked or given, fought until one of us can no longer hold a weapon. The survivor claims the right to determine the fate of this pathetic village and everyone in it." "Agreed," Einar replied, though Brynhild could see the way his grip on the warhammer had shifted subtly, preparing for the explosive violence that was about to erupt between them. "Then let us discover," Bloodaxe said, drawing his axe with a motion so smooth it seemed like liquid shadow, "which of us truly deserves the title of legend." The two warriors raised their weapons, and in that moment the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The battle erupted with the sudden violence of a lightning strike, both warriors moving with speed that defied their size and the resistance of the knee-deep water. Bloodaxe's opening attack came as a sideways sweep designed to take Einar's head from his shoulders, the black blade whistling through the air with lethal precision. But the shield breaker was no longer there. He had flowed backward like water, his own hammer rising to meet the axe in a clash that sent shockwaves across the fjord. The sound of legendary weapons meeting echoed like thunder, causing several villagers to stumble and fall despite standing 50 paces away. Sparks flew from the point of impact, not mere friction but something deeper, the collision of artifacts forged in ages when the gods still walked among men. Bloodaxe's bone decorations rattled with the impact, while the runes on Einar's hammer blazed with sudden inner fire. "Still quick," Bloodaxe acknowledged, with genuine respect as he spun away from the parry, his axe describing a figure-8 pattern that kept Einar at distance while seeking openings in his defense. "But I can smell the rust of domesticity on you, shield breaker. 3 months of playing house with farmers has dulled your edge." Einar's response came not in words, but in action, a devastating overhand strike that would have split Bloodaxe from crown to pelvis had it connected. Instead, it met only water as the Raider King flowed aside, his counterattack coming as an upward thrust aimed at Einar's ribs. The shield breaker twisted desperately, feeling the axe blade part the mail rings over his heart by a margin measured in heartbeats. The exchange established the pattern of their combat, Bloodaxe fighting with the fluid grace of a dancer, his movements economical and precise, every attack flowing seamlessly into defense and back again. His style spoke of decades spent refining violence into an art form, of countless opponents who had underestimated the deceptive elegance beneath his brutal reputation. Einar fought differently. His approach built around explosive power and the kind of devastating strikes that had earned him his name. Where Bloodaxe flowed like water, the shield breaker struck like an avalanche, each blow powerful enough to shatter bones, each movement calculated to end the fight with a single decisive moment. But the precision of his attacks had indeed suffered during his months of peace, his timing fractionally off, his distance slightly misjudged. "You feel it, don't you?" Bloodaxe taunted as he deflected another massive strike, his axe blade ringing against the hammer's haft. "The weakness creeping into your bones, the hesitation that comes from remembering what it feels like to be human." I told you domesticity would be your death." The psychological assault was as dangerous as any physical attack, and Einar could feel its truth eating at his confidence like acid. The gentle months with Brynhild had indeed changed him, had restored pieces of his humanity that the hammer had consumed years ago. But those recovered fragments of his soul now worked against him, creating moment of hesitation where once there had been only cold certainty. Bloodaxe sensed the weakness and pressed his advantage, his attacks coming faster now, a whirlwind of black steel that forced Einar backward through the churning water. The Raider King's axe seemed to be everywhere at once, slashing at throat level, sweeping toward ankles, thrusting like a spear at vulnerable joints in the ancient mail. Each strike was perfectly timed, perfectly placed, part of a relentless assault designed to overwhelm even legendary reflexes. But legends were forged in the crucible of impossible odds. And as Bloodaxe's axe finally slipped past his guard to open a line of fire across his ribs, something fundamental shifted in Einar's grey eyes. The pain burned away the last vestiges of the gentle giant who had carved toys for children, leaving only the core of what the shield breaker had always been, a force of nature given human form and terrible purpose. His counterattack came without warning, the warhammer moving in a horizontal arc that should have been impossible to generate from his off-balance position. Bloodaxe barely managed to interpose his axe, and when the weapons met this time, the impact drove him backward through the water with enough force to create a wake behind his stumbling form. "There he is," Bloodaxe breathed, his eyes lighting with genuine pleasure as he recognized the transformation. "There's the warrior who made kings tremble in their beds. Welcome back to the world of honest violence, shield breaker. How I've missed you." But Einar's response carried none of the cold satisfaction that had once defined him. Instead, his voice held the weight of profound sorrow, the sound of a man who understood exactly what he was losing with each blow he struck. "This is not who I am anymore," he said, advancing through the water with the inexorable power of a glacier. "But for them, for the innocent lives behind me, I will become him one last time." The warhammer rose like a falling star reversed, and Bloodaxe's eyes widened as he recognized his own death approaching. The final blow came not with the thunderous impact of legend, but with the quiet certainty of justice finally served. Bloodaxe's axe, raised to parry what he believed would be another devastating overhead strike, met only empty air as Einar's warhammer swept upward in an arc that spoke of decades, mastering the geometry of death. The ancient weapon's runes blazed with sudden fire as it connected with the Raider King's ribs, the sound of breaking bones lost beneath the triumphant ring of iron against mail. Bloodaxe staggered backward through the churning water, his black armor cracked and steaming where the legendary hammer had struck. For a moment, the most feared raider in the northern seas stood suspended between life and death, his reptilian eyes wide with an emotion he had not felt in decades' surprise. Then his knees buckled, and he fell forward into the fjord with a splash that seemed to echo across the watching mountains. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the harsh breathing of a warrior who had just reclaimed his terrible legend. Einar stood motionless in the knee-deep water, the war hammer hanging loose in his grip, his grey eyes fixed on the spreading crimson stain that marked where Bloodaxe had fallen. Steam rose from the weapon's runes as they slowly dimmed, the supernatural fire fading like embers returning to ash. From the watching longships came the sound of horns, not the harsh war calls that had announced the raiders' arrival, but the mournful notes that marked the death of a king. Bloodaxe's warriors, bound by oaths older than memory, began the ritual that would carry their fallen leader to whatever afterlife awaited men who had lived by violence alone. Without their commander's driving will, they became merely raiders again, dangerous but directionless, wolves whose pack leader had fallen to a greater predator. "The terms," called the scarred lieutenant who had delivered Bloodaxe's challenge, his voice carrying across the water with grudging respect. Your victory is acknowledged, shield breaker. The village is yours to protect. We sail with the evening tide. But Einar made no response, standing statue still in the blood-stained water, as if the hammer's weight had become too great for even his legendary strength to bear. The villagers began to emerge from their positions along the shore, moving tentatively toward their champion, their voices rising in celebration that grew louder with each step. They had been saved, their homes preserved, their children freed from the shadow of slavery that had loomed over them since dawn. Yet as Brynhild approached her husband through the shallows, she could see that victory had come at a cost that gold could never measure. The gentle giant who had carved toys and tended herb gardens was gone as completely as if he had died alongside Bloodaxe in the fjord's depths. In his place stood the shield breaker, legendary warrior of the northern seas, his eyes holding the flat, distant look of a man who had fed too much of his soul to the hunger of his weapon. "Einar," she called softly, her healer's instincts recognizing the symptoms of a man lost in the echoing chambers of his own violence. "It's over. You can come home now." He turned toward her voice with the mechanical precision of a man, following instructions he did not fully understand, the war hammer still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his grey eyes, a spark of the man who had chosen exile over burning a village full of children. But then the moment passed, and she was looking into the face of a stranger who wore her husband's features like a poorly fitted mask. "I remember you," he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "You are the healer who took in a broken stranger. You are kind. You deserve better than what I have become." The words fell between them like stones cast into still water, each syllable confirming Brynhild's worst fears. The man she had married, the gentle soul who had found redemption in love and service, had been consumed entirely by the weapon he had wielded. The shield breaker had saved Hestgard, but at the cost of everything that had made Einar worth saving. Around them, the celebration continued as villagers embraced their children and began the work of rebuilding their disrupted lives. Henrik and Knut returned from their doomed mission to Raven Island, having somehow survived Bloodaxe's trap through luck and the chaos that followed their leader's death. The future stretched before Hestgard like a golden road, free from the shadow of raiders and secure in the protection of a legendary warrior. But Brynhild felt none of their joy as she watched Einar begin his slow walk toward shore. He moved like a man carrying an invisible burden, each step weighted with the knowledge of what he had sacrificed for their salvation. The war hammer dragged through the water behind him, its runes dark and cold, a tool of violence that had finally claimed its ultimate price. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the fjord in shades of gold and crimson, Brynhild made a choice that would define the rest of their lives together. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently over his on the hammer's haft, feeling the tremor that ran through his massive frame at her touch. "Then we'll find him again," she said, with the quiet certainty that had guided her since childhood. "The man who chose mercy over might, who carved birds from driftwood, who found peace in healing rather than harming. He's still in there somewhere, buried beneath the legend, but not destroyed. And I have all the time in the world to bring him home." For the first time since the battle ended, something stirred in the depths of Einar's grey eyes, not recognition, but the faintest possibility of hope. The shield breaker had won his final victory, but perhaps, with love and patience and the gentle persistence of a healer's touch, the man who had wielded him might yet find his way back to the light.